Hey,
Hey,
hey. Hi, Ben. God bless you. How are
God
you?
bless you. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for joining me this Tuesday
Yeah.
evening.
Thank you. Thank everyone that's on already and
Oh,
watching. Good evening, and thanks for joining us on Bible study. It's very
yes.
exciting.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful, lovely Tuesday evening. It's kind of scary earlier. We were talking about how I was running behind. I had some traffic because there was literally hail in Kissimmee, believe it or not. Like, if you want proof, I have videos, but it was very scary. And I got here later than I wanted to, but we're here, we're happy, we're excited, and we're so glad to join you or have you join us for Bible study this Tuesday. How you feeling, Ben? How you doing?
I am feeling good, but I don't have the monumental task of getting through the Book of Judges and the Book of Ruth. I'm not sure everyone necessarily knows we're going through both of those tonight, but we are. We're going to be hustle and bustling, spending most of our time in Judges, I believe.
Yes, most of our time in Judges.
Okay.
Judges is the longer book, a lot more going on. And Ruth is only 4 chapters, but it's still such a beautiful narrative, such a beautiful book. But so because of that, and because Ruth, the events that happen in Ruth are going on at the same time as what at the same time as Judges,
Right.
we thought it made sense to kind of do them together. So
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna be journeying through the books of Judges and the book of Ruth
Awesome.
because it's a lot. We'll get started. But
Yeah.
feel free to continue to just invite people to join us, um,
Yeah.
tag people, share the stream, and also feel free to talk to us during the
Yes.
study for
Yeah.
sure.
Share your insights, your thoughts, your questions. If you have questions, we'll try to spot them and give our sort of weigh-ins on the questions and we love to hear your questions and your comments and your wonderful insights. So um, yeah, yeah. So we'll pray and we'll get right into it.
Yes,
Right.
right.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of coming together through technological means to gather together to study and immerse ourselves in your word. Um, we struggle with it sometimes and we wrestle with it, but we ask your wisdom and your guidance in our hearts as we seek after you and your heart. I ask that you'll give wisdom and guidance to Sister Jasenia and to all of those who are here with us, watching now or later. Um, we ask all of these in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right. So yeah, we have more people as we were praying. More people joined us.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. We have Pastor Sarai, Pastor Michael. God bless you guys. My husband Ryan. God bless you, love. We have Brother Varian joined us. God bless. Pastor Ezekiel. Woo, woo. Welcome. And we have your lovely wife,
My
beautiful wife,
beautiful wife.
amazing wife,
Yes.
Evelyn. Thank you for joining us online. Yeah, let's get to it. As Pastor Mike said right now, Judges is a wild one.
It's a
It
while.
absolutely is. It's a lot. But bear with me. Like I said, we're gonna get through this. Just a disclaimer too. Um, if it sounds like I have left some things out that we possibly don't happens in Judges or happens with these judges, that's on purpose. And not because I wanted to, it is just a lot of narrative. It's a lot that goes on. So I'm gonna go through as much as I can, um, in a way that makes sense for us to present these key themes and these threads that we see in
Right.
Judges.
We
But I encourage you. Yes, go
we
ahead.
say I feel like we say this at the beginning of each book of like there's a lot of things that we might end up skipping over that we will end up skipping over and it's just a good reminder of like what we're trying to do is give a high level fly through of these books so that we can all understand the narrative that they're all plugged into um, as a tool and as a palette wetter if you will for you diving deeper.
Yeah,
um, so that's what we're trying to do with this walkthrough of the Old Testament is give these high level overviews. We're not like simply skipping things we don't like to talk about or anything like that. So
Yeah, believe me, I struggle. I would love to tell you everything that happens,
I would
but
love to go down every rabbit
I
hole with
know. But
all of
then
you.
be journeying through one book of the Old Testament for a year, for at least half a year. Um, but that's the whole point, is to get you excited, to actually want you to make you want to read it on your own, and to equip you with the tools to help you read it on your own and understand it and grasp it and start seeing these little threads and these
Mhm.
themes yourself. So let's get into it. The book of Judges. All right. So book of Judges. This book picks up where the book of Joshua leaves off, right? And it follows through the history of Israel's 13 judges over 350 years, right? So these stories pick up shortly after the death of Joshua. We know that the people no longer have a leader like Moses or Joshua, and they neglect their relationship with Yahweh. That's kind of a pattern with them, but we're going to continue to read in Judges that they continue to neglect their relationship with Yahweh. And the results of that neglect is this recurring vicious cycle of sin, punishment, repentance, and then there's rescue by a judge, which is a leader sent by God. So before reading this book, just want to encourage you um, to change your worldview, or your understanding of the word judge. These aren't people with gavels and black robes and white
Wigs.
this wigs and these eyes, I guess. No, judges. We're not defining judges in the way that we view them or we define them. These judges are civil and military leaders who were also appointed to arbitrate judgments and settlements disputes among the Israelites. So they are to enact laws and command Israel's army. So at this point in history too, we read that Israel is still a theocratic state, right? Which will bring us to our first key theme, which is theocracy. That's the first new key thing we see here in Judges. And what's a theocracy? A theocracy is a system of government in which priests rule in the name of God, which is supposed to mean that God rules the nation, right? Not a king or president or anything like that, or anyone like that. This is what Yahweh desires for Israel, that he would be their king. But we will see, like we have seen before, that just because God is the leader does not mean the hearts of the people will naturally respond to God's laws or naturally respond to God. Um, they respond to what they want, what they desire, and what they love. And we will also see the same response from some of these judges as well. And of course, we can see this response in our own selves, in our society today. One moment, please. I'm sorry, y'all. I had a cold last week because my daughter, she gave me a cold, so I'm still getting over it. um, so if you see me stop for water, you see me mute real quick, that's because of that. Um, so again, we still see that response to God even in our own selves, in our own society today. So before we get into it, okay, we have these judges. God's appointing these judges. The people are supposed to appoint these judges. So what does God order or expect from a judge? Where do we find that standard? Where do we find that? We find that in Exodus chapter 18. We read a convo between Moses and his father-in-law Jethro. Um, like I said before, Moses is technically Israel's first judge, right? And because of this, Israel would come to Moses, and it would take Moses from morning to evening every day to resolve these disputes between the people. Um, and Jethro sees this, and he offers him an advice. He tells him, "Well, this isn't good. Like something's got to give. You got to come up with something, a system or something." Um, and we read his. I'm posting the verses now. Ben, if you can read them for us.
Yeah.
It says 18 verses 19 through 25. 26, sorry.
And this is Jethro speaking right at this moment.
Yes. Yes.
Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this as and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all of these people will go home satisfied.
And then verse 24, 25.
Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. And this is the basic concept of delegation, which
Yeah.
has applied to all forms of leadership for thousands of years now.
Delegation is a good thing. Still is, for sure.
So he chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves.
So pretty solid piece of advice.
Yeah.
Solid piece of advice. That's wisdom, godly wisdom, right? So not only is it a solid piece of advice, but it does in detail or lay out what the qualifications of a godly judge should be. And what are those? I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry, you can finish your thought.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to interject real quick as a very quick aside.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Since we're talking about Jethro, I had wanted to touch on this in Numbers, but we didn't have all of the pieces to this sort of like thing. But we do in Judges. Many of you reading through may have noticed in Judges chapter 4, it sort of like jumps back, or it tells us about Hobab. And Hobab we hear about in Numbers. He is referred to as the son of Reuel. So, and there's a lot of this question of like, who is exactly Moses' father-in-law? Because we learn that his wife Zipporah is supposedly has a father named Reuel, but then also Moses' father-in-law is called Jethro. And then we learn about this Hobab guy in Numbers who is supposedly the son of Jethro. So we would think that would make him Moses' brother-in-law. But in Judges, he's referred to as Moses' father-in-law as well. So there's questions, and sometimes this makes people wonder if there's some sort of like scribal error that's going on. Mm-hmm. But what's going on here is, well, there's a lot of possibilities about what's going on here. They don't give us all of the information. For example, Jethro and Reuel may be the same person who has two different names, or one of them is a title. But additionally, we live in a much different society where we talk about relationships differently. So they're living in a very patriarchal society, and one in which, like, just like we might refer to our forefathers, your fathers would be potentially your grandfather or your great-grandfather as well. So it's completely possible also that Hobab is in fact Moses' father-in-law, potentially Zipporah's direct father, that Jethro is her grandfather, and Reuel, if he isn't also Jethro, is like a great-grandfather and the head of the clan, and thus the father of all of those in the clan, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's just a difference of the way that we conceptualize family and units and clans. But it's not just like, oh, someone made a mistake. It's just a weird cultural linguistic difference between us. And I wanted to bring it up because while it's a small detail, it can be troublesome for a lot of people because it seems like an error, if you will, in the text.
Yeah, sure. But we see that whether it's his grandfather, his father-in-law, his father, grandfather, his friend's father, he's a father figure, obviously, to Moses, that he respects what he has to say. As he listens to him, and he gave him really good advice on it on this, and but he also lays out these qualifications of what a judge should be, a judge appointed by God, a godly judge should be, and those attributes are these: it's to fear God, hate dishonest gain, and be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to God, right? So as we read Judges, you're going to see how these judges respond to or are accountable to God's call, and how they respond to or how they line up with these qualifications. So, amen, Esther, blessings. God bless you. So before we move forward, like I said, Judges is it has a lot is going on. There's a lot of moving parts. We're introduced to a lot of different names. We're introduced to 13 judges. Then we're introduced to Israel's enemies and all of these different tribes and people. So that's a lot of names there. And then we hear about their idol worship and the idols they worship. So because of that, I wanted to present a this sort of chart um, that will show us just the names of Israel's judges, the ones that we read about in Judges. And if you like, I definitely recommend you taking a screenshot. This is gonna help you as you read through Judges yourself. So when you bump into these names, when you see these names, oh, this is a judge. Oh, this is this person. This is that person. So I'll give you a couple minutes or a couple seconds just to screenshot this. If anything, go back when this is saved, and you can go back and screenshot this. But it's just a list of the 13 judges of Israel that we'll be reading about. Then here's another list of Israel's enemies. Again, look, you see the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Philistines, the Sidonites, the Hivites, and whoa, all of these people, all of their enemies, all these people that oppress Israel, all these people that they're constantly fighting with or
Yeah,
in
and
war
they
with.
have to fight. Yeah.
Um, they, it's good. Take a screenshot. And when you see these names and you see these people, it's easier to navigate who's who, like who's who and what is going on. Um, and then just a list of the idols or the other gods that Israel ends up worshiping. Um, Here in Judges is we've seen them before. We've seen them in the Torah. Um, they're mentioned, but we have Baal, Ashtoreth, and the Asherah pole. And just quickly, just to give you a quick recap of who they are, Baal is a name given to several different deities who are designed as false gods or idols. However, it's most often used to describe the specific Canaanite god of fertility and rain. Um, Ashtaroth is the queen of heaven, to whom the Canaanites burned offerings and poured out drink or liquid offerings to. And their Asherah pole is a sacred tree or pole that stood near Canaanite religious locations to honor the pagan goddess Asherah, also known as Astarte. So these are prominent because they enter the land of Canaan and they overtake this land, or so they're not in the way they're supposed to, but these are the idols that they are basically confronted with, and they're basically um, tempted to, or Moses and Joshua were afraid that they would be basically influenced to follow, to forsake Yahweh and follow these idols, they Canaanite idols. So take a screenshot, save that. It's gonna help you as you read on your own. Um, so as we move forward, at the end of Joshua, we read that Joshua tells the people that the Lord commands them, like I said, to push out or drive out the people from the land they are to conquer. So they are to drive them out and possess the land. He said they're not to associate with or align themselves with these people. And in Joshua chapter 23, verse 12 through 13, and I'll read it quickly here, but I'll put it here. Um, Sorry, there's some technical difficulties here with on the difficulty. Um, but we read in Joshua chapter 23, verse 12 to 13, he tells them, but if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you. They'll become problems for you. Whips on your back. They will enslave you, and thorns in your eyes until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. So Joshua reminds them, and we continue, he reminds God, Joshua reminds them of God's faithfulness, that every promise that he has promised them has been fulfilled. Like there's no reason not to trust God. There's no reason to forsake God for these idols. God has been faithful and he's fulfilled every promise he's made to us. So, but he tells them if they violate, and he basically tells them too that he goes before them, that you can conquer this land because God has already conquered this land for you. You can push these people out because God has gone before you and pushed them out already. Like, all you have to do is listen. All you have to do is obey. But he warns them if they violate this covenant with God, they will perish from the good land. God will not go before them. And they'll lose this good land that he's given them. We will see that God will deliver Israel into the hands of their enemies, and they will be overthrown, and they will be exiled because of their unfaithfulness to God. So, and we read that Joshua tells them, which kind of resonates to Moses, that he knows that they will not be able to serve the Lord. He's like, you guys can't do this. You're not be able to do this. But people respond, and they say that they will, and that they will obey God and not serve other idols. So before we get into chapter 1 of Judges, really quickly, Pastor made this really awesome map um, last week about the kingdoms in Canaan, kind of how the promised land looked
Yeah.
before Israel entered. You see the Canaanites, Amorites, uh, Ammonites, the Moabites, Amalekites. You're gonna read about these people. You're gonna meet them again in this text. Um, but then he also made a map, and Ben, if you could put that up, of them dividing up the land, of how the land looked or was divided up after they entered the promised land. So we see here that the tribe of Manasseh, tribe of Gad, Reuben, Ephraim, Dan, tribe of Benjamin, Manasseh, I said Manasseh already, sorry. Issachar, Judah, Simeon, Reuben. We see how this land was divided up once they entered into the promised land.
Yeah.
So it's good to keep in mind. It's good to keep in mind kind of like how they divide this land up once they actually enter it. Um, but in
Yes.
chapters 1 through 3, after Joshua dies, we see the people. First thing we see the people do, which is a good sign. The first thing people do is they consult with God. Great, wonderful.
Awesome.
Great, talk to God. Yes, consult with Him. Like, and they ask Him, which tribe is the first fight against the Canaanites? As we go and conquer this land, what is the tribe we're going to send out to start this thing off with? So we see they start off strong, consulting God, and God responds to them and tells them that Judah shall go up, and that He has already given the land into their hands. So they capture the Canaanite king Adoni Bezek, that's his name, and they cut off his thumbs and his toes. Kind of bizarre, kind of crazy. Read the whole thing. But that's what they do. Um, and as we continue to read, so things are looking good. In the beginning, looking good. They're asking who to
Not
send
that king,
first.
but
That gives them the victory. They cut off this king's thumbs and toes, like I don't know,
he
like
can't hold a sword anymore, I guess.
exactly. He can't run either.
Yeah.
but but we see that starts off pretty good, right? But as we continue to read, we see that even though Israel is dwelling in the promised land, they still haven't completely conquered the land. There's still groups of Canaanites across the land and major cities. So when you're looking at this map, you're seeing these tribes here, right? See Manasseh, and you're seeing Asher, you're seeing Naphtali, Gad, Judah. Yes, you're seeing the land divided, but there are Canaanites still in this land.
Yeah.
We read that they do not push them out. They do not conquer the land the way that God has told them to do it. There's still groups of Canaanites across the land and major cities. And we got to remember, it wasn't just to enter the land. God commanded them to drive these people out, that He has
Mhm.
already gone before them and drove them out Himself. But instead of driving the Canaanites out, they pressed them into forced labor, which God warns, God hates anyway. And I believe Moses and Joshua warned them against doing anyway. Like, don't do this. Don't make them your slaves. Push them out. Um, and then we continue to read. We read the reasons that are given as to why they did not drive them out. He said that they had chariots filled with iron. They were at a disadvantage because um, they were on this flat land, and with these chariots, these people have bigger advantage. But the reality is that these were just excuses.
The Egyptians had chariots too.
Yeah, these had chariots too. And Israel has already seen the mighty hand of God.
Yeah.
Like, they should know that if God had told them that He's already given them the victory, that He means it. So all these things, all these reasons as to why they couldn't push them out, end up just being excuses. And by the end of chapter 1, we read that 9 out of the 9.5 tribes in the promised land west of the Jordan River have Canaanites living among them. So basically, the whole land.
which just ends
And
up prolonging the violence.
yeah, for sure. And by verse 21, we see that they lose the city again. So they disobey Yahweh, again, choosing their own wisdom. Whose wisdom? That theme again, from Genesis and from just the whole Bible story so far. um, and we will read that they will suffer the consequences. This vicious cycle that we talked about, vicious cycle that we will witness. They'll sin against God, fall into oppression, cry out to God to deliver them. God delivers them. They repent, enjoy peace, and then they decide again to sin against God. So, and it's all over again. It goes over and over again. It's this vicious cycle. And just I wanted to point out too, just really like as Israel's entering this land, we got to remember too, and it's not to make an excuse for them. It's just kind of maybe to try to understand. Because you're like, man, like you've seen the mighty hand of God. Like, why can't you just listen? Why just push them out? Like, remember, is this generation, their parents were slaves in Egypt, came from slavery, and then they themselves were living this life in the wilderness. Like, and now they're surrounded by these cities filled with architecture, art, literature, trade, goods. Guarantee you they were intrigued by the sophistication of the society. And they probably aspire to live this way. Like, man, we want to live like these people. How do we obtain this lifestyle? Well, you obtain that lifestyle by doing what the Canaanites do: worship other gods, have sex with prostitutes, sacrifice your children. But that's everything that goes against what God has told them to do. That's everything that goes against the life God has set them apart to live. You know? So, chapter 2, God shows up in the form of the angel of the Lord, right? To rebuke them for not driving out the Canaanites and tearing down their altars as they agreed to. Um, and that brings us into the second key theme, which is angel of the Lord. And we've seen this key theme before, but I wanted to highlight it here in Judges, the angel of the Lord. So yeah, I'm trying to read past this comment. I didn't have it on camera. I'm sorry, Bass. Let me see. Let me see. We see so many times the Bible God commands them to do it, and they do part. Yep,
Yeah.
they do part. And the thing is that what do you call it? Part is not. Oh yeah, Esther. Yeah, we see that partial obedience is not obedience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we see that the consequences of that. And Pastor said the Passover celebration is to always remind of Yahweh's mighty hand and remember the chariots and their riding in the body of the waters. Yeah, there's like you can again. It's to kind of try to understand that they're being intrigued by what they're seeing, but the reality is that they have experienced, they know firsthand the mighty hand of God. They
Mm-hmm.
know who God is, and they still choose to do that. But like Esther said, but how many times do we do it?
Yes, I think that's key. It's so easy to sit here and shake our heads in posterity, and in hindsight. Um, but as we talked about at the end of like Deuteronomy, or during Deuteronomy as a whole, the text is asking its reader to adopt this as, in a way, your narrative, not just a history of some people that lived a long time before you, but that in a way this is all of our narratives,
Yeah,
um, and we have to keep in mind of humility that while it's a different time, that we still have to be careful of our own snares
yeah, for sure.
that tempt us to lead to go away.
Absolutely. But just moving forward, like I said in chapter 2, God shows up in the form of the angel of the Lord, which is our next key theme. It's like angel of the Lord, and we read in Judges chapter 2, verse 1 through 5. Ben, if you could read that.
All right. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord.
Yeah, and it just sounds so similar to what we read in Exodus. So we read that God has spoken to them in this way before. You
And
know,
by the way, Bokim means weeping. That's why.
well, look at that. Being good. That I didn't catch that. That's good. My
That's why they called it Bokiming, because that's where they cried.
very, very very it makes sense. That
Bokim,
makes sense.
Bokim. Yeah,
Boking, right? Boking.
I
But
think it's Bokim.
you know, so we see here again, though the people we see the people repent. They're crying. They're crying, wept out loud. They call this place Boking. This is where they shed their tears and they offer sacrifices to the Lord again. But unfortunately, we see that though the people repent, their repentance is short lived. And as we continue to read, we have flashbacks to the previous readings in Joshua. Um, so we basically read just a recap of the death of Joshua and this narrative of this allotment of these springs to Caleb's daughter and her cousin Othniel when he won her hand in marriage, right? So we read about that, but reality, the flashback to Joshua's death, is really just a reminder of the time when Israel was following God more closely. Um, but after Joshua dies, that generation failed as leaders because they didn't appoint new leaders and they didn't tell God's story to the following generation like they were supposed to. They only led with the present in mind. So therefore their legacy fails to continue. Remember in Exodus, when we read it in Exodus chapter 18, verse 20, judges are supposed to what? They're supposed to appoint judges who tell the people about God, who teach them about God's decrees and instructions and show them the way they are supposed to live and to behave. But instead of appointing new leaders, Israel worshipped idols. And if you can read that for me, Judges chapter 2, verses 10 through 15.
All right. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreth. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress.
So God promises not to drive out their enemies since they've broken the covenant. Like he said he would. If they break the covenant, he wasn't going to drive out their enemies. And this will serve as a test to Israel. Um, and as we continue to chapter 3, we are introduced to the first four judges. And the first judge we are introduced to is Othniel.
And
Um,
if I could just take a moment,
sure, yeah,
I
for
think
sure.
it's really important, like the fact that a generation arises who does not know Yahweh or the work that he's done for them. And that's always, it brings Judges a little bit into focus to remember that line for me as I continue reading, because when you start to see the stuff that the people do and that these judges do and say, it really feels like they don't know him, and they don't, like, even when they interact, they don't really understand. They almost speak to, even when they're working, they're calling out to Yahweh, even when they're like, yeah, we'll listen to you. There's definitely this feeling that they still think about Yahweh as essentially just another one of the gods,
Yeah,
and it feels so foreign in a way, the way
yeah,
that they interact with him.
it is. And it's great. It's good you say that because I think we'll feel that way when it comes to some of the judges that we see later on.
Mhm.
They're judges that are appointed by the people, supposed to be godly judges, and it feels like God is foreign to these people,
Yeah,
not to these leaders.
yeah.
And well, these first four that we're going to touch on, they seem to be the best the best it gets when it comes to the judges. But the first one that we read about is Othniel. And Othniel, we read about him a little earlier in the chapter. Again, that whole with the springs and Caleb's daughter and him marrying Caleb's daughter. So he's Caleb's nephew slash son-in-law. Sounds weird, not weird to the Bible. It's what happened. Um, but we can read about Othniel. It's very brief, but he's the first judge that we read about, and you can read it here. Uh, Chapter 3, verse 7 through 11. It says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroths. There goes those idols. That's why it's really um, resourceful to take a screenshot of that. That page we showed you. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. Wow. To whom the Israelites were subject to for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Oh, yeah. And then it says, the Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, the king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So pretty good judge. It's like so far we're reading. Well, we get the little that we get, and we see that Israel
So, all right, all right,
land
all right.
had peace for 40 years. It says until Othniel dies, because what happens after he dies? We see this vicious cycle again. We see we talked a lot about we talked about the vicious cycle we talked about the Israelites choosing their sin over peace, and they rebel again. And then God strengthens their enemy against them. And we read about King Eglon of Moab. And he gathers allies, attacks Israel, and takes back Jericho, which was Israel's first conquest in the Promised Land, which is really sad.
It's like it's being
Uh,
undone.
yeah, man. It's like it's being undone. And we read that Israel is enslaved for 18 years until they what? Call out to God, cry out to God to rescue them. And that's when we are introduced to our second judge, Ehud.
And in the sense of it feeling like it's being undone, there is a feeling we were talking about before of this book that there's a lot of moving backwards. It feels like where it's like, okay, well they lost Jericho, and they don't even know the Lord. Like you said, it sounds a lot like what they tell us about Egypt at the beginning of Exodus, of like a Pharaoh rose who did not know Joseph or his God. And so
Yeah,
it's a generation arises that does not know the Lord or the works that he does. It's like now there's sort of, yeah, it feels like it's moving backwards.
yeah, for sure. Sure. Um, yeah, it's moving. It's like it's moving forward, but moving backwards, and
Right.
actually
It's like
moving forward.
Israel's becoming all of the things that were their enemies in the past.
Yeah,
They're
for sure.
becoming the people of the land. They're becoming Egypt, and
Yeah, for sure. And it's really sad. It's really sad, like to lose that first conquest.
mhm.
Sad to read, And they were enslaved for 18 years after that, until they cry out to God to rescue them again. And that's when we're introduced to Ehud. He's a second judge. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Um, and the narrative we get from him is about 10 verses. I want to read it. It's pretty, it's a pretty crazy story.
He's the
Um,
coolest Benjaminite.
yeah, I think he's pretty cool too. That's why I wanted to share it. But like what happens is just kind of crazy to read. But Ben, because of that, and he's a Benjaminite, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm gonna have you read it.
All right. All right. Okay, here we are. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera, the Benjamite.
Very
The
specific.
Bible doesn't give us details for no reason.
Yeah.
A left-handed man. The Israelites sent him with a tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword out of about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. Now, notice it's on his right thigh. Normally, a sword would be held on your left side because you draw it with your right hand. Just pointing that
This is left-handed.
out.
So,
He presented the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After
how
Ehud
big
had
you
presented,
say? How big is this man? We're gonna see.
very apparently,
We're gonna
after
see.
Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." The king said to his attendants, "Leave us," and they all left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, "I have a message from God for you." As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged.
How big
Ehud
was
did
this
not.
guy?
Ehud
His
did
hand
not
was
pull the
sticking to
sword
the.
out. Yeah, Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it.
How big was
Then
this guy? Oh my
Then
god.
Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said, "He must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace."
Oh
They
my.
waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fall into the floor, dead.
What a narrative. I can just picture that. Like I was reading it, I was just this imagery, and I was like, the sword is gone. The
It's
sword is gone, and there's guts everywhere.
it's it's visceral. Yeah.
Yes. And yes, Pastor. I guess left-handed people are extra.
Well, they definitely
See this guy.
they're definitely apparently so uncommon and unexpected that they don't even pat down the right thigh. Like,
Exactly, because he got away with it. Sure.
yeah, which is
But
just bizarre to me, but I guess the security measures were not that experienced, you
yeah,
know?
apparently, fortunately, but what a narrative! And we continue to, as we continue to read, we read that he will lead the Israelites in killing 10,000 Moabites and taking back the land again that they lost. And then we also read that there is peace again for 80 years. So again, all right, Ehud, kind of gruesome, kind of crazy what happened to your sword, but you seem to be an all right judge, right? We're
Mhm.
reading about. And then we're introduced to our next judge, which is Shamgar. And we don't get much about Shamgar. I'm good about a sentence on him, but we know that his name and his family origin points to him being a native Canaanite who had turned to worship Yahweh. So he had turned from his idols. He was a native Canaanite. He turned from his idols and he turned to worship Yahweh. And he was established as a judge over Israel, leading them into victory over the Philistines. So that's awesome that he wasn't a native Israelite, but he was still appointed as judge and he turned towards Yahweh. Um, and he led them into and God led them into victory under Shamgar over the Philistines. Um, and let's continue to read chapter 4. Into chapter 4, we read that Ehud and Shamgar, after Ehud and Shamgar, they pass away. After they're done, they're gone. Uh, we read the people sin again. And God gives them into slavery for over 20 years under Jabin, the king of Canaan, the king of Canaan. So we see this again, this vicious cycle. They sin again. They have peace. They choose sin over peace, and God delivers them into the hands of their enemies. We read that the king of Canaan, they have a military advantage. They have here come these chariots again. They have 900 chariots filled with iron, and we read that Israel was cruelly oppressed under them. Um, so what are they going to do, Israel? Now we know about the vicious cycle. What's going to happen next? They again cry out to the Lord for help. And this is where we are introduced to our next judge, which is Deborah.
Okay.
Um, when we read about Deborah, um, she the one of the first things we read about her, and I'll just share it here, um, in chapter 4, verse 5. We read here that it says that she held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. So what's the first thing we see? We see that she's honoring God and honoring this role of a judge. You see, we're reading that she's presiding over legal cases. We later read that she is a wise, bold, and level-headed prophet who keeps her word and fears the Lord. So honestly, she's one of the judges. She's probably the one that honors God the most and sticks closest to His commandments. And she was a woman, girl power.
She
There
had
you
a
go.
palm tree. I
Yep, she
mean,
had a palm
it,
tree.
it itself evokes a lot of imagery of like this prophetess that's so well known for doing her job so well that it's like, yeah, Deborah's out. She's under her palm tree. The
Yep,
palm tree of Deborah. That's what we call it. It's the
yep.
Deborah's palm tree. It's the palm
And,
of Deborah.
yep.
And if you need something, if you need judgment, she's there. She's wise. You go to her. It's yeah.
So, ladies, where are you at? Israel's best judge was a woman, and she probably was the one. She's the one that actually, again, honors God and sticks closest to His commandments. So, woo woo, that's
Yeah,
right,
we even
ladies. Where
see
you at?
she shows a lot more courage too than some of the war leaders around her that should be showing courage.
For sure, for sure. You know. So but the one role that she doesn't fully step into is this role of military commander.
Mhm.
So she says that. But she says that God has appointed a man named Barak for that position, and he agrees to this role, but refuses to go to battle without her. Um, and I'm just going to, Amen. Women power through obedience. I'm seeing the comments a little delayed, but
Yeah,
wonderful,
and this
amazing.
guy Barack that's supposed to be supposed to be the commander of the army. He's appointed to march, right, to be the general, and
Yeah,
he's like if you don't go, Deborah, I'm not going.
yeah. He's like,
I'm too
that's
scared to
cool.
go without you, Deborah. And Deborah's like, it really reads like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, I'll go.
He's like, that's cool. I agree, but if you don't go, I ain't going.
Yeah,
Like,
I'm not going without you, Deborah.
for sure. That's right. And it's like what Pat, like, I'm going to highlight what I said, women power through obedience. Amen. It's like Pastor says, it shows it's not really about gender or ethnicity. It's about a posture of fearing and honoring Yahweh. That person Yahweh will esteem. Amen. It's true. And we will see that as we continue. Um, I'm really honestly continuing to Ruth, most likely. but, but yeah, yeah, an Israelite judge, a Canaanite judge, and a woman judge. So good. So, like you said, like Barack says, he goes, okay, that's good, all fine and dandy. I agree, but if you don't go, I ain't going. So we read here that Deborah tells him, "Certainly, I will go with you." In verse 9, not verse 99. I don't know why I came like that. Verse 9. Certainly, I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. So we look at this. At first, it sounds like she may be saying that the victory will be hers, right? But this is actually prophetic. So she's not speaking of herself, but of another woman, and we'll read that very soon. But it also just brings up this theme of the prophet. Here's Deborah again, not only just operating in wisdom and operating in settling disputes, but operating in the prophetic as a prophet to the people. Like she was very closely aligned to the standard of what a judge should be to these people, leading them to God, also in tune with God to be able to prophesy the way that she did.
Right,
Um,
and pulling off, and this is even we'll actually in another book we're going to get more into this theme, but this is a small little theme about that bouncing off of what Ezekiel was saying about that the things that a human is going to gauge to say, oh, that person seems like they'd be a good leader. Like, oh, we need a big strong man, for example,
yeah,
right? We'll see this way more heavily later, especially when we get into Kings and things like that. But here we're already seeing it, and in ways even before it's getting this volume is being turned up on this theme of there's something that God sees that is more important than just the outward appearances which humans judge each other by. And so I'm sure most of them living in a patriarchal society would not expect or themselves appoint a woman to be doing something like this. But God has led her, and she's been in obedience with God on that, because it's not about what she is on the outside. It's about the wisdom and the obedience and the heart of God inside,
For sure. Yeah.
and the
So that's,
subversion of those expectations too.
yeah, absolutely. And we read that the Israelites kill a lot of Canaanites, but the military leader Sisera, he escapes and he ends up at the tent of Jael, this woman named Jael, who's the wife of Heber the Kenite. Um, and we read that Jael drives a peg and a hammer into Sisera's temple while he was sleeping, and she kills him. And Israel once again gains victory over their enemy. So there goes the fulfillment of the prophecy. It
His
wasn't her,
temple is in his head.
his temple. Yeah.
Yeah, his
It's
temple
like,
is in the side of his head, which could be
it's a peg.
confusing
Yeah,
because
for sure. Remember Peghead? He's a Peghead. No.
yeah,
So, but
Englishism.
yes, but yeah. So God does give them the victory through a woman. It's not directly Deborah, but through this woman Jael. So, and as we read chapter 5, we read that it's a song. It's called the Song of Deborah, and it's a song praising God and His works. And then the land has peace again for 40 years. So these four judges seem to be pretty good, right? By God's standard, especially Deborah, you know, pretty good judges by God's standards. But after the 40 years of peace, the Israelites fall into sin again. And what will happen in Israel and their judges to come, we read, will just get worse and worse. Um, and as we add into chapter 6, we read that the Israelites are oppressed by the Midianites. We read that they're so oppressed and afraid that they hide in caves to escape the Midianites. So, and we read that the Midianites eat all their food supply. It's just terrible. And after 7 years, the Israelites, you guessed it, cry out to God again. And maybe they expect God to send another military leader, but God knows what they need. And then He knows that they need something different this time. So He sends this prophet, someone who will speak truth and call out their sin. I'm going to post it here. Um, and that is Judges chapter 6, verse 8 through 10. Brandon, go ahead and read that.
He sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all of your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me."
Very reminiscent of Joshua, very reminiscent of Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
very reminiscent of the things that
No,
God has told them over and over again. Very reminiscent of Torah, the Torah,
of the Bible so far.
the Bible so far, yes. So then we continue to read. We read that the angel of the Lord comes and appears to our next judge, which is Gideon. So we read that God tells Gideon that he is with him. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and tells him, "Hey, I am with you." But then we read this narrative between Gideon and the Lord, or the angel of the Lord, and it says that Gideon responds to him in this way. Responds to the angel of the Lord in this way. He says, "Pardon me, my Lord." Gideon replied, "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all His wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?'" So Gideon seems to have heard that. It seems to have been passed on to him, but he questions him.
He's heard the
"You're with
story.
us." Yeah, he's heard the stories. He questions him, "Why has all this happened to us if you're really with us? Um, did the Lord not bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us." And man, he's bold. Like, I guess, and you can see that he doesn't really know who he's talking to. Honestly, like, not really. Like, you can see that insecurity there. Also, him not really understanding who he's talking to. He says, "But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" like, like, I'm sending you
Yeah,
to
this is a
rescue
theme
people.
of people encountering the Lord, though, of like not really fully understanding who it is they're talking to and the ridiculousness a little bit of their
Yeah.
like Moses. I mean, this is actually very similar to Moses's encounter at the burning bush. God's like, I'm sending you, right? And Moses too is like, well, but I'm kind of like, I don't speak that well. And
Yeah. I remember that
it's
too.
like, did not I make the human's mouth? He says, like, do you understand who you're talking to?
Right. Yeah, for sure. And like you said, for sure, like, but this is how you know that Gideon doesn't really understand
Yeah.
who he's talking to right now. Like that he's straight up talking to the Lord.
Mhm.
But you see that Gideon replies to that, and he says that he replies to that by saying that he's the weakest of his clan, which is the clan of Manasseh, and that he's the least of his family. And he asks God for a sign. And he goes and sets a food offering before the angel of the Lord, who then cooks the food offering with fire and then disappears. And Gideon then recognizes who he's dealing with, and he just panics, right? But the Lord tells him to have peace and to not be afraid. He tells him verbatim, "You are not going to die. Like, chill out. It's fine." Um, but in an act of worship, Gideon builds up an altar and calls it "The Lord is Peace." And God tells Gideon to tear down his father's altars to Baal and to build an altar to Yahweh there instead, which is what the Israelites were instructed to do in the first place when they entered the land. Um, and Gideon does this, you know. Now, again, because it's an overview, I can't go over every detail with Gideon, but we do read that Gideon does ask God for more signs and more tests to be sure God is truly calling him to lead Israel as a judge. So it's really tests not only to see that God is who he says he is, but tests to see that God is really calling him. So you can see the insecurity, you know. Um, but after God's confirmation, Gideon and all 32,000 of his men set out for war. But God tells him that his army is too big. He asks Gideon to send home anyone who was afraid, and he conducts his own testing trials to skim this army down to 300 men,
And it's
which is
already a
less.
bizarre, would seem like a bizarre statement to any human of like, wait, my army's too big to go to battle? What?
Sure. And then he ends up with less than 1% of the men he started with.
Yeah.
But we know that God decreases the army so that he can increase his glory. And he can show Gideon just how great he is. He can show him this mighty hand, how mighty God is. And God leads Gideon to overhear a conversation between two Midianite soldiers, a conversation about an interpretation of a dream that one of them had that confirms that God will give Israel the victory over the Midianites. So they defeat the Midianites by making noise with their trumpets. The Midianites become confused and they start killing each other. And it says that over 120,000 Midianites died in this battle. And God gives Gideon the victory, even though he was full of self-doubt. So, but as we continue to read in chapter 8, we start to see the shift in Gideon. We read that he asked some people from East Manasseh to feed his army, but they refuse. And then because of that, he promises to destroy the town of Succoth. Then he moves on to the town of Penuel, and they deny him food too. So he promises to destroy their tower. And honestly, his you can when you read it and you read more details, you can kind of see that his response is kind of warranted, but it's also really extreme. Um, and it's kind of as if he's operating out of that insecurity still, like he's still insecure, and like even after all the confirmation God gave him, he's operating out of this insecurity, and you see this shift in him, because of that. So he chases down the Midianite kings, he captures them, kills them, and then he goes back and he fulfills his threat to Succoth and Penuel. He destroys them. And when you read this, the difference between this chapter and the last chapter of Gideon, like you don't see a mention of God here. And this seems to be something that Gideon is doing under of his own volition. Like there's something happening in his heart. So you start seeing the shift in him. And then we read that Israel tries to make him king. And we read that he refuses. And he says, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But then he does something despicable, something that the Lord really hates. And I'm going to have you read that, Ben, if you can.
All right. Here we are. I do have one request that each of you give me an earring from your share of plunder. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings, he asked, came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family.
Yeah. So we see that he made a golden ephod for himself, something that we've read that only the high priests were allowed to wear. So to make his own ephod was a direct violation of God's commands and really an act of arrogance. You start seeing this in Gideon.
Mm.
And I read this quote and I thought it applied so well. It says insecurity and arrogance are just different sides of the same pride coin. And that's exactly what's happening. Gideon was insecure and then he became arrogant. And those things just formulate into pride. That's what it was. He was prideful.
And
So
uh,
mhm.
and on this train that seems to be steaming full ahead, full astern, backwards, this is an echo very much of the golden calf in
Yeah,
Exodus,
for sure.
where Aaron asked everyone to bring jewelry, golden jewelry, which he fashioned into an idol that they worshipped. And that's almost verbatim what's going on here.
Yeah,
And so it's definitely meant to be a parallel to that and meant to see us as this is the same problem
yeah,
that started all the way back there at
yeah.
Mount Sinai.
So Gideon was insecure, and now we see he's full of arrogance. And it's as if the entire time Gideon has been the judge of Israel, it has never been about God. It's always been about Gideon. So during the time, we read that during the time that he was positioned as judge, Israel has peace from war, but they do not have peace with God. So we read that they prostitute themselves after Gideon and his ephod, and it's not a Canaanite idol, but it's an idol nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And it may feel, and I felt like there's like a lesson. Obviously, there is a lesson in all this for us, but what stood out to me is like for them, it may have felt less sinful because it's Yahweh adjacent, like it's God adjacent. Like this is appointed by their judge that God has given them the victory through. That can't be that bad, right? Like it has to be okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is a great example of how we can lie to ourselves in subtle ways that can distract our hearts from worshiping God alone.
And they essentially,
Yeah,
yeah, they're almost worshiping themselves, is what they're
yeah,
doing.
for sure. And it's like they it's like these little subtle lies like, oh well, but he's our judge and he did this, so it can't be that bad. But meanwhile, it's idol worship. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem as bad because it's not a Canaanite God, but it's still not God. Um, and we read that Gideon keeps the peace for a while, but he does not point the people to Yahweh. We also read that Gideon has a lot of kids, including 70 sons, one of them being our next judge and my least favorite, Abimelech. Um, and though Gideon didn't want to be king, but we read that Abimelech's name is "My father is king." So I'm like, all right, is that a little hint there that no, but being one of 70 sons, Abimelech is probably not the first in line to take his father's position when he dies. And we read just how divisive and scheming Abimelech is. He kills all of his brothers on a stone. Um, I was reading a commentary that said that it's possible that that one stone is an altar, which likely means he could have been offering them up as sacrifices to Baal. So Abimelech is just from the beginning terrible. But we read that his younger brother Jotham escapes, and we read also that the leaders of Shechem, who seem to be Abimelech's uncles and their brother's uncles, his brother's uncles, gathered beside the great tree of Pilar, which is the Asheroth pole, the idol that we mentioned. And it says that they crowned him, Abimelech, as king. So this feels like a real coronation, but it's not. It's not legit. He's not really a king, but they do this anyway. Um, but then we read that Jotham Since he escaped, he runs up to the top of Mount Gerizim, which is a mount of blessing, and he shouts out a parable to them. And the point of this parable is that Abimelech is not worthy to be king, and that he warns them that he will be a destructive force. This is a prophetic curse uttered from the mount of blessing. But the people don't listen, and they continue with Abimelech as their king.
Mhm.
But Jotham did his part, and honestly, it seems like he's the godliest one in his family. And he leaves the consequences up to God. But we eventually read that Jotham's prophecy is eventually fulfilled. We read that God sends an evil spirit that causes division between the people of Shechem and Abimelech. And that because of this, the people set up an ambush against him. But he kills them and destroys the city altogether. And this is the place where he lives. Like, this is where he lives. His house is here. His life was here. And he destroys this place. And then we read that he kills 1,000 more people, including leaders, fulfilling the prophecy of Jotham, that Abimelech will be a destructive force to the people. We read that Abimelech destroys the same leaders that had positioned him. And that's insane. Um, but then we read he tries to conquer the town of Thebes and tries to burn down a tower with more people in it. But then here comes this woman again. We read that this woman throws a stone at him, at his head, and it mortally wounds him. Something about these women aiming for the head. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's too long to be the same woman, but I
yeah,
like to imagine it's the same woman.
her great granddaughter or something.
Yeah.
Um, so she mortally wounds him. Like, he's gonna die from this hit in the head with the stone. Um, but he's so arrogant. He asks his armor bearer to finish the job and kill him with his sword, so that people wouldn't say that a woman killed him. But here we are in 2023, thousands of years later.
I think we can all agree a woman killed him.
Yep, and we're still reading that a woman played a huge part in killing him. Ha ha ha. So Abimelech, we read that he was manipulative to no end, and he even died trying to manipulate his legacy. And the man who killed his brothers on a stone also died by a stone. And this was a judge. It's terrible. And in chapters 10 through 12, we read about 6 more judges. We read about Tola and Jair. We read about we don't know much about them, but we do know that Tola led Israel for 23 years and that Jair led Israel for 22 years. We also read he had a lot of sons too, these judges and their sons, and a lot of sons. But he rode as many donkeys as he had sons. He had 30 donkeys. And then we read that Israel is back at it again with the idol worship. Um, and I'll just read it quickly. We read in Judges chapter 10, verse 6 through 7. It says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtaroth and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became very angry with them. And he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, what he promised he would do. Like, man, but read these idols. Like, is there anything these people won't worship? Or anyone these people won't worship? Like, it's insane. They just worship all of these pagan idol gods. Like, there's no, like, they're running rampant with their idol worship. It's crazy. Um, and we read that the Philistines and the Ammonites shatter and crush the Israelites. And for 18 years, they were oppressed. So, in their oppression, what happens next? You guessed it. The Israelites cry out to God again. Um, and Ben, if you want to read that for me, verses 10 through 16 in chapter 10.
Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." The Lord replied, "When the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Moabites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. let them save you when you are in trouble. But the Israelites said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do with us whatever you think to be just, but please rescue us now. Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, but he could bear Israel's misery no longer.
Yeah. And like this really honestly when I read it broke my heart because I felt like you can feel the agony in God's heart. Like, and it's crazy because when even the beginning of this book, but in the Torah we would read God, the words of God. And Yahweh, he says, I am the God who delivered you from Egypt. And we read in the beginning of this book too, like, I'm the God that delivered you from Egypt. He sends his prophet to say that. And now you're reading, the Lord replied, when the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, like before it was just Egypt. And now he's mentioning all of these people that he's delivered them from because Israel has prostituted themselves to these people and their culture and turn from God. Like it went from just Egypt now having to deliver you from all these people, and it's just so crazy to read. Like man, from the beginning of this book to now, it's crazy,
Yeah.
you know. And it's just disheartening to hear of all the other hands God has had to deliver them from. Like it's really terrible. But like we said, like we read, God this time God does them differently, and He's not going to raise up a judge to save them. And He tells them to cry out to their other gods to save them. Go cry to them. So I'm not going to save you. But Israel's response suggests that maybe they really got it this time because they agree that they don't deserve to be saved and they accept God's words while still begging for mercy and help. But they know that God is their only hope. So then they forsake their idols and worship Yahweh. Um, and when we read that the Ammonites are ready to battle the Israelites on the Transjordan, which is the area of Gilead, and Israel tries to rally up a sergeant for their army themselves. But instead of asking God for direction, they try to come up with this person on their own. They talk amongst each other. And they hastily appoint a man named Jephthah. And I'll put his name up here so you guys can have it. And he's on the chart. But quickly, I can't get into all the details of Jephthah. We have only so much time. But basically, Jephthah is a Gileadite who was an outcast because his mother was a prostitute. So Israel outcasted him. And then now looking for a judge, they approach him and ask him to lead their army. Um, and even though God did not appoint him as Israel's judge, he is Israel's judge nonetheless. So we see that God shows himself faithful to help them, which brings us into our next key theme, which is God shows up for his people. Um, so yeah, God didn't appoint him as a judge, but God still shows up for his people. And we see that he always does. We've read it before and we continue to read it that God shows up for them. God shows up for Israel. um, but if we continue to read about Jephthah, we read that he has made a terrible decision. He makes this hasty vow with God that if he gives him the victory, when I go home, the first thing to come through the door of my home, I will sacrifice to you, Lord. And he didn't really need to do this, but he made this vow to God.
It's one of those bizarre moments where it's like they're not connected to their culture or the law. Like
Sure.
there's sacrifices that he could make that God's asked for. He didn't ask for some random whatever that comes out of the.
Yeah,
It's like a weird. It's a very bizarre and weird vow, which is when if he knew the law and he knew their history, it would be entirely unnecessary.
for sure. And that's what I'm saying. Like, they didn't consult God in
Right.
choosing this guy. They
It's
just chose him. But
it's the
because
type of
God,
vow you'd make to one of the fickle pagan gods.
yeah, for sure. So then, but because God is faithful to them, he shows up for them and he's he backs up um Jephthah. So he didn't have to make this hasty vow, but he did. And the person that comes through his door is his daughter, his only child. And like, so why was this type of decision? Like you said, God has already made a promise to Israel. He promises Israel the victory if they obeyed him. So Jephthah didn't have to make this hasty vow. Like obedience to God is the way to victory. But he does this and he feels like he needs to go through with this. But if he would have known Leviticus chapter 5 or Leviticus chapter 5, we read that like, Leviticus 5 gives us the option of revoking a vow that would result in sin. And murdering your daughter, definitely considered sin. But because, so it's possible, again, they appointed this judge that does not fully know the law that he's expected to make these people live by. So we read that he sacrifices his daughter to keep the vow that he hastily made to God. And then we read that there's an issue between the tribe of Ephraim and Jephthah. They start fighting each other, and it's just crazy. We read that 42,000 men are lost from the tribe of their lives are lost from the tribe of Ephraim, and it's just a sign that things are getting worse and worse for Israel. And as we continue, chapter 12 um, ends with a quick description, and I encourage you yourself to go read it yourself. Um, of the next three judges, and their names are Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. So go and read it for your own. It's very, very brief. Um, what they what is said about these judges. So I told you it's a lot. It's a lot. I'm cutting out a lot. It's a lot. But stick with me. You guys with me? You guys with me still? Thank you for sticking with me, honestly. So as we enter chapters 13 to 16, we read about our final and possibly the most well known and famous judge, and his name is Samson. So, again, probably the most popular. Like if you've heard of a judge, probably heard of Samson.
One of
Um,
the most famous. I mean, he's the last,
yeah, he's the
and he
last.
reads he reads the closest to maybe a Western superhero that you
Yeah,
can get.
yeah, like Superman or something like that, because his strength and his superhuman strength or this really powerful strength that comes from God, right? But honestly, and I hate to break it to all of us that had, were in Sunday school and pictures of him and colored him in and heard all these stories about Samson. Honestly, Samson, when you read Judges, he's probably was one of the most wicked judges in Israel's history. And when we read about Samson, we read chapters 13 to 16, we read that the people of Israel turn from God again and they're oppressed by the Philistines for 40 years. But then we meet this man named Manoah. And we read that the angel of the Lord shows up to tell Manoah's barren wife that she is going to have a son, and that this son will help play a role in rescuing Israel, and that she should raise him to live under the Nazarite vow. Now, what is the Nazarite vow? You can read about the Nazarite vow in Numbers chapter 6. Um, Basically, the gist of it is that they are to have no alcohol, no grapes, no cutting their hair, and no touching anything that is dead. So God assigns this role to Samson from before he was born, like from his mother's womb. So while she was pregnant with him, his mother also had to follow this vow.
And
And
this would have been like, because the Nazarite vow was for a set period of time that you followed these rules.
yeah,
But this is being spoken over Samson's whole life, including conception in the womb and to birth. So
for sure, for sure. And when we read about Manoah and his wife, like we read that you can see that they wholeheartedly believe in this prophecy over their son, and that they follow God's commands in regards to their son. They offer sacrifices and grain offerings unto the Lord. And then when we read in chapter 13, verse 24 to 25, we read that the Lord that Samson grows up and that the Lord blesses him, and we read that the Spirit of the Lord begins to stir in him. Like so, at this unknown age, we're reading that the Spirit of the Lord begins to stir up in Samson. And in chapter 14, the first decision that we're able to read that Samson makes seems like a foolish one. Uh, and you can read that, Ben, if you could read that, that'd be great.
Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. His father and mother replied, Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me. She's the right one for me. His parents, She's the one, Dad.
She the one.
His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel.
So even though it's like in like parentheses in a sense, like seems kind of hidden, but we're allowed the text to show us that though it seems foolish, the text shows us that this is a decision, that this decision is a plan that Samson was working out and that was actually set in motion by God, right? So he's secretly devising this plan to overthrow Israel's oppressors, the Philistines. And later we also read that he keeps a secret from his parents. He gives a secret that he killed a lion with his bare hands. Now, when reading this, you're like, well, why would he keep this a secret? And some would say, oh, wow, such a humble man keeping these secrets, not telling people about him being able to kill this lion with his bare hands, um, and trying to come up with this scheme to free Israel from the Philistines. But under like, but remember, he's under this Nazarite vow. So under this vow, he wasn't allowed to touch anything that was dead. So not only did he touch the dead lion when he killed it, we read that a few days later, he scoops honey out of his carcass and starts to eat that honey.
Which seems
So
like that's potentially where he messed up, because
yeah,
killing the lion, it describes as something he did because the spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. So I'm wondering if it's like, well, that wasn't of the breaking, but definitely taking the honey out of the carcass. That was something he should have done, which it describes as him turning aside to do.
yeah, but still, no. If you kill the lion, probably dead in your hands when you kill them. And I get what you're saying, you know what I mean? But he's still under this vow, and he's pretty much breaking this vow, and he's not telling his parents. So you kind of just see all that to say that you see like this pattern with him, this little secrecy pattern with Samson. Um, and we continue to read. We see that he makes a lot of foolish decisions. We again we just get to see that he's sneaky. We see a sense that he's prideful, entitled, driven by lust and impulsive desires, and that he often again breaks the rules of his Nazarite vow. And that you see that he makes reckless decisions. Like again, I'm not going into everything with Samson, but read about when he, again, understandably he was angry and understandably angry, but he lights these foxes on fire and throws them at these people and burns them alive. Like you can just see that he's driven by this impulsive desires, and he makes reckless decisions, and he acts on his anger, and that he's moved and governed by his desires. Um, and as physically wrong as he was, as physically strong as he was, sorry about that, we see one of his biggest weaknesses was women. We read about that in chapter 16, verse 1 through 4. And if you can go ahead and read that for me.
One day, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, Samson is here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we'll kill him. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Some time later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah.
Yeah, so he goes from a prostitute to finding in love with this woman in the Valley of Sorek. And you read that he falls in love with this Philistine woman named Delilah. And we read that the Philistines take notice and they offer to pay her to find out the secret to his great strength. Now, reading this, either this guy was a ridiculously deep sleeper, or he was foolish, or super arrogant, or all of the above.
Well, he
Because
had to be
yeah,
foolish because her intent was made pretty clear, like two or three times beforehand.
exactly. Or he was the deepest sleeper I ever seen or heard of. Like this, she tried to ask him 3 times what the secret of his strength was, but he lies about it repeatedly. She ties him up while he's sleeping. One time she ties him up while he's sleeping. She ties his hair down. The Philistines just so happen to show up conveniently while he's sleeping, and he just told her the secret to his strength, and he didn't know something was up.
Yeah,
Like
like every time he told her a fake secret, she attempted to use it against him.
exactly, like that's a coincidence. Um,
Yeah.
so it's hard to tell if he doesn't trust her or he's just being sneaky and secretive. Like I feel like the text is letting us see that he is. Um, but we read that he finally tells her the truth, and I'll read that here. It just says here in chapter 16, verse 17, says, "So he told her everything. There's no razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazarite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I will become as weak as any other man." So we read that she shaves his head, and we also read after she shaves his head that the spirit of the Lord leaves Samson. So Samson's disobedience leaves him leaves him literally vulnerable. And we can tell from the reading that Samson does not. One thing I feel like we can tell from the reading is that Samson does not take God's calling over his life and his vow towards God seriously. And honestly, I feel like it is doubtful that he will ever get serious unless he's humbled, which is what happens next. We read that the Philistines overtake Samson and they strip him of everything he's ever identified himself with. Everything he knows about himself is gone. His hair is gone, his strength is gone, his vision is gone, and the spirit of God, which is really his strength, is gone. Then we read that at a pagan festival, when the Philistines bring out Samson to entertain them, Samson asks the servant that brought him out, that was holding his hands, to place him near the pillars that support the temple. And this servant listened to him, probably because he thought, "Oh man, this guy don't got his hair anymore, and he's blind. What's he gonna do? I'll put him there." Um, but when Samson is placed there and he puts his hand on the pillars, we read that he cries out to Yahweh God. Go ahead, Ben. Read that if you can.
Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my two eyes. Then Samson reached towards the two central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one side and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all of the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived.
So we read here that Samson truly calls on God at the end of his life. We see that he had God's gifting, but he had no intimacy with God until, honestly, we read here at the very end,
Hmm.
which
It's
is,
only it's only at the end that he, yeah,
yeah, it has to.
comes close. Like, yeah, he comes close, the closest to acknowledging the strength by asking God for the strength at the end.
Yeah, for sure. But it's crazy him being the last judge you read about. Um, he's gifted. He's given strength. He's even been called into this vow, this powerful,
Hmm.
sacred, holy vow, and we see how gifted he is, but we see that he has no intimacy with God, and that's something we can learn from too. That gifting does not equal intimacy, and how important it is to have intimacy with God. So as we move on to chapter 17, we're almost there, guys. And I know we still have Ruth, but we're gonna do it. All right, stick with me. um, as we move into chapter 17, we transition from these personal accounts of these judges and into stories that really shows the true devastating state of Israel. In chapter 17, verse 6, and we also read the same the same these same words in chapters 18 and 19. They start out 18 and 19. And these words are, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." Um, so we see the same introductory verse in the beginnings of chapter 18 and 19 as well. But
Almost a state of anarchy is
yeah,
essentially what
for
we're
sure.
saying.
Sure. But what did we learn in the beginning? That Israel was supposed to be this theocracy, though, right?
Hmm.
So wasn't God their king? Understand that this verbiage is not indicating that Israel needs a physical king or that they didn't have one in God, but that they rejected Yahweh God as their king. So we see the evidence of that as we have read through Judges, and we continue to see the evidence of that in the remainder of this book. Now, chapter 17 to 18, we read about this man named Micah, an Ephraimite who steals from his mother, confesses, he steals her jewelry. He steals from her, and she confesses. And what does she decide to do? She decides to build an idol to Yahweh in response. But why would she do this, right? Like, we know how God feels about idols, but this just shows us a lack of awareness to God's law and a total disregard to the ones they know to follow, right? And as we continue to read chapter 19, we read the story of the concubine and the Levite. A concubine was a household servant with fewer rights and less permanency as a wife, whose job was really just to have babies, right? Um, but we read that she decides to leave this Levite. Um, but he decides to go after her and win her back and bring her back with him. So we read that the Levite goes to her father's house. Things go well there. She decides to go back with him after 5 days that he's there. Um, and like I said, after 5 days, they decide to get up, leave, and go back home. So he starts this journey back home with his servant and his concubine. Now they stop to rest in an Israelite area named Gibeah, which is a Benjamite town. This older man comes and urges them to stay in their house. So instead of staying in the town center where they plan to stay, they go to this man's house. While they're there at the house of this man, we read that these Benjamite men come to the house and demand to have sex with the Levite. So what does the Levite do? He saves himself by sending his concubine out to them. The concubine he went after and tried to get back and win her back. He goes and he sends her out there to these Benjamite men. We read that trigger warning. I'm sorry, it's really hard story to read, but we read that they rape and assault her all night until she dies. They basically kill her. We also read that the next morning the Levite takes her body, cuts it up into pieces, and sends them to the surrounding tribes of Israel to show that the Benjamites were guilty and just how devastating the state of Israel was in. And when we read chapter 20, we find out that not only were these Benjamite men that killed and assaulted this woman, but they were leaders of the Benjamites. So here's just another example, more examples of what failure of godly leadership does to the people.
And this is definitely it's like a climax of just how terrible things have gotten in Israel, to the point where this story, we've seen echoes of bad points in the biblical history so far, and this one echoes the story of Sodom, of when
Yeah,
the people of Sodom. Um, it's a very similar story, and so now it's a weighty comparison for it to be making a parallel of like that a tribe of Israel is now behaving like Sodom, which is
yeah,
viewed as like the epitome of evil and unrighteousness and sin. uh, it's a dire situation that they're in, and we see that despite the state, even the other tribes seem to recognize to some level how dire, how terrible it is.
yeah, for sure. And you know, not only does it show like the examples of what a failure of godly leadership does to his people. Not only did these Benjamite leaders fail her, but the Levite that's supposed to be that she's his concubine. He was supposed to protect her, and now he goes and cuts her up and sends the parts of her body to the tribe of Israel to tell them how bad things are. Meanwhile, you were supposed to protect her. How bad is it with you? And you just see just what this failure of people of these people of people of these people that are supposed to step up and be leaders, godly leaders, what it does not to only to this woman, but it's just also just shows what it does to the people. And as we continue to read, we read that 400,000 men from the other 11 tribes go and confront the Benjamites about what happened and what their leaders did to this
War.
concubine woman. Yeah, and it starts a civil war.
Now Israel's
Like,
at war with itself.
yeah, and I don't know if you saw in the chart that I had up before, all of Israel's enemies, the last one said Benjamites, and in parentheses says themselves. Now they become their own enemy because of just the atrocities that happened. Um, it starts a civil war. You see, one of the first civil wars in Israel. But the other 11 tribes, they ask God for guidance. After 3 days of war, God gives the victory to the rest of Israel against the tribe of Benjamin. But now they're trying to figure out how to keep the tribe of Benjamin from disappearing altogether because they killed so many of them. So they come up with, again, they don't consult God. They come up with their own plan. And they go to Jabesh Gilead, a city in East Manasseh, which is across the Jordan River. And because they did not respond and fight with them in this civil war on the side of the other 11 tribes, they decide to go into the city, destroy their city, kill everyone but the virgin women, and then bring these virgin women back to the Benjamite men and give them to them. But then when they see that there's not enough women for these men, I believe there was 400 women and 600 men, they go to a festival where they kidnap more women that are dancing at this festival and give them to these men. So they fail to consult God and they make an even bigger mess than the one they had. And it's just like, this just is messier and messier. Like this whole thing started with you confronting them about this woman, this concubine woman. And now look at what you're doing to these women.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't make any sense. And it just shows, like, that's the best word for it, senseless.
Mm-hmm.
It
And
shows how senseless these people are.
right, and I think that the one of the major things that comes out of Judges is this, like they had no Israel. They did whatever they thought they wanted to do. Right, that's what it says several times. And I think that's the sort of the core of Judges is what we see is every time that they try to make a decision without God, it turns into a huge mess. Um, and so I think that's an important thing to like. It's a messy book. It's a messy scroll. It's a messy story, and it's because they repeatedly are making their own decisions, doing what's good in their eyes. They're taking the fruit. They're operating on their own wisdom, and it's creating more and more messes.
Yeah, for sure. And all of this can be traced back to an uncontrollable lust of a handful of leaders and this unprotected measures of this Levite, right? And by the end of Judges, we read that thousands among thousands of people die as a result of reckless, ungodly leadership, which brings us into our last key theme for Judges, which is accountability. So, this whole book and the heartbreaking issues and events can be summarized by and pointed back to the leadership that was supposed to, remember, fear God, hate dishonest gain, and be the people's representative before God and bring the disputes to God. But instead, they do not fear the Lord. And what is fear of the Lord? To stand in awe and wonder of God, to glorify God, to trust God wholeheartedly. There's evidence of selfish motives and decisions made to glorify themselves instead of God. And they don't lead the people to God. They do not remind the people of who God is. They are not interested in being the people's representatives or bringing the people's disputes before God. They're not even interested in leading the people to resolve the disputes in a godly manner. And there is lack. You see that there is a lack of accountability to who God originally called these judges and these leaders to be. The lack of accountability from the people to seek God and involve Him in choosing their leaders. The lack of accountability to who was supposed to be their king, which is God, who is God. This is the result of the devastating state of Israel at this time. These are the results of that behavior or choosing not to choose God, right? Or do what God told them to do. So now that we've read through Judges, a good question to ponder would be, does Israel fall away because they have no strong leadership or because they're among the Canaanites? And honestly, the answer is both. But the root of all of this is still a heart issue. And we see this among the people and among the judges, among the leaders. Now, quickly, you got 15 minutes. We're going to get through Ruth. We're going to enter the book of Ruth. And the reason why it makes sense to merge them together is because the events of Ruth are happening at the same time as the events in Judges. So we enter the book of Ruth, and we read that Ruth takes place during the time of Judges, like I said. And the very first sentence of Ruth says, "In the days when the judges ruled." So here we read about an Israelite man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their sons Mahlon and Chilion, who, because of famine and other struggles, decide to leave Judah and live in the plains of Moab, which is where the Moabites, King Eglon, the knife, the knife swallowed her basically. um, and there their sons met and married two Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. Just to, by because we're going to be going through this quickly, um, I wanted to suggest that if you want to get even more in detail, we're going to get into some details of Ruth, but we want to get into more in detail with Ruth, the book of Ruth. I recently preached a sermon named "Honor Makes Way for Redemption," and you can find that on our YouTube channel. Um, Maybe about a month or two ago, you can find that. And if you need help finding that link, just let me know. But I do go through the book of Ruth pretty in depth um, during that message. So I just want to recommend that if you want to get more in depth, you can find that on our YouTube channel. Um, but again, going back to the story, to the narrative, um, we read that they marry these two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But then we then read also that Elimelech and his sons die. We don't know how they died. We just know that they die. And now these three women are left with no husbands, and this leaves Naomi with no children as well. Now we just learned when Judges, we just learned the importance of godly leadership in a society. And now these women are left with no one to lead them. So these women are vulnerable. They have nothing. Their status as if they were nothing. And it's very dangerous to be a woman during this time, especially an uncovered, unprotected woman. Look what we just read in chapter 19 in Judges, right? But by Naomi's request, through tears and sorrow, Orpah goes back to her family in Moab. But Ruth clings to Naomi. And I'll read it here quickly. We read in chapter 1 of Ruth, verses 16 through 18. It says, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me.' When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her." So here we read that Ruth makes an oath to Naomi, but she's also making an oath to God, Yahweh. So Naomi returns to Israel with Ruth, but Naomi's heart is bitter, and she believes that God is punishing her. But she has no idea the blessing that God has in store for her. We read that Naomi then sends Ruth to work in a field that belongs to one of her relatives, and this relative's name is Boaz. This is where Ruth can pick up leftover grain for her and her mother-in-law, to have something to eat. But we read that Boaz notices her. He notices not so much her looks. He doesn't notice her looks, but he notices her work ethic, her kindness, and her honor towards her mother-in-law. That's what catches his attention. Um, and if you want to read Ruth chapter 2, verse 8 to 12, right ahead.
So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you have left your father and your mother and your homeland, and come to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge."
And this will bring us to our first key theme in Ruth, which is the key theme of honor. We see that Ruth's honor of her mother-in-law does not go unnoticed. And it starts to be reciprocated here. Here is where Ruth finds protection and refuge. We see this man, a leader in his community, step up and care for and protect this woman. A stark contrast to the leaders we just read about in Judges, right? And we also read that Naomi sees potential here. She sees a little spark. And she decides to do a little matchmaking. And she tells Ruth to dress up nicely, take a shower, and she sends Ruth to see Boaz at night. And we can read about that in chapter 3, but we'll read chapter 3, verse 7 through 9. And if you can read that for us. Yeah.
Mhm. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family."
So here we read, here, this leads us to our second and final theme in Ruth, which is redemption slash redeemer. Or redemption. Oh, it's supposed to redemption slash redeemer, but honor is good too. But redemption, redeemer. So the Hebrew word for guardian redeemer is a legal term for one who has the obligation to redeem a relative in a serious difficulty. So Boaz is not just showing favor to Ruth, but he is honoring his deceased relative, Elimelech, who can no longer be there for his wife, the Elimelech's son, and Elimelech himself, for Naomi, who was a mother and a wife too. So he's stepping in and he's redeeming these women. He's providing safety, he's providing protection. And what we just read shows us that Ruth makes her intentions known and basically proposes to Boaz. Like she proposes like, yeah, I want to marry you, basically.
Mhm.
Um, and Boaz seems willing, but he then tells Ruth that although he is the guardian redeemer of their family, there is another who is more closely related than he is. So because of this, he has to have a conversation with them and give them the opportunity to do their duty as the guardian redeemer. But he does tell her, if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. So then, chapter 4, we read this conversation between Boaz and the elders regarding Ruth and Naomi. And I'll just read it quickly, the first part. Um, it says, in chapter 4, verse 4 through 6, it says, I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. So look, this other guardian redeemer says that he'll redeem it. And he's like, all right, I got it. No problem. I'll redeem the land. I'll redeem all that. But then that he's willing to step in and redeem this land. But then we read the scripture say, or the narrative says, then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. So now that this Moabite woman comes with the territory, now it's just this, not just land. Now we have this Moabite woman that comes with it. The other guardian redeemer cannot do it. He says it might endanger my estate. Yet another leader who won't step up. But Boaz is the leader who is willing to step in. So despite this conversation and knowing how it might endanger his estate, we read that Boaz steps in and agrees to redeem the land and all that comes with it, including the Moabite woman Ruth. The elders agreed to be witnesses to this, and instead of discouraging Boaz or condemning him, they bless him. We read that Boaz and Ruth marry. They have a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of who would be one of Israel's physical kings, David. And Naomi has also been redeemed, as she has now gained another son through Obed. Now, and that's the end of the book of Ruth. Pretty much just 4 chapters. I encourage you to take the time to read it. Um, but the story of Ruth shows us what can happen when a leader steps up in the way God intends them to. And this family also displays God's heart to redeem. God wants to redeem Israel. God's desire is to redeem his people. And not just Israel, but anyone who turns to him, even if they don't share the same DNA as Israel, like this Moabite woman, right? You know, what do we learn from Judges and what do we learn from Ruth? That God works through loss, he works through depression, suffering, betrayal, longing, family, tragedy, etc., to advance his plan to redeem Israel. And this is true for us today. God still has a plan to redeem his people. He still has a plan to redeem us. And even as the Israelites spiral into wickedness more and more every day, like we were reading, God still desires to be their king. Later on in the story of the Bible, we will read we'll see that he will give them a physical king. But one day he will also send them a true king, one that will redeem them and all of humanity. And that's the end of Judges and Ruth. That's
Oh, awesome! Wow.
it. Yay! We
Thank you all for still being here.
yes, thank you. Thank you for
um,
sticking with me.
Real
Sticking with
quick, so
us.
these, if you want to get the a snapshot of it, these are the key themes in Judges: the theocracy, the angel of the Lord, God showing up for his people, and accountability. And then in Ruth, we got two key themes: honor and redemption, redeemer. So yeah. I guess we'll just do a few quick announcements, and then
Yes.
we'll go out. So this Thursday is Encounter Nights. It's the youth and young adult service, but everyone is welcome.
Yay.
It's not streamed online, so you'll have to attend in person. But feel free to join us then. On Friday, there's a men's fellowship, the bowling night. So if you're signed up for that, remember to come. I look forward to seeing you guys there. And if you have questions about some of the Bible stuff, we could talk about it while we bowl.
Yay.
Um, and is there is
Women's.
women's
The
fellowship, correct?
women's
Right?
is
Yeah,
Friday too. Yes. Please
yeah.
RSVP with Pastor Tanya. So you can get information on location and all of that good stuff. So men, if you want to ask Ben about Bible study stuff in the men's fellowship, women feel free to ask me some things too if you want to. We'll be
We've got a
above
representative.
represented, I know.
Yeah,
um we encourage you to join us. The women,
yeah,
looking forward to this time with the women. It's always a wonderful time, deeply rooted, incredible. Pastor Tanya does an incredible job leading us women and just pouring into us. And I encourage you to be there for the women's gathering women and be there for the men's gathering
yeah.
men.
And if you
So
haven't signed up for the men's fellowship yet, I believe you can still do it. You talk to um, Edison Cabrera or Will Castro. I believe they are the ones in charge of that.
yeah.
So, and then after Friday, on Sunday, we have Sunday service at 7 a.m. We have Sunday morning prayer, which you can join us for. And if not, we have our Sunday service that starts at 10 a.m. I believe we are still continuing our Jars of Clay series. That's been a wonderful blessing. And I believe, and then next Tuesday will be a prayer call.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, have I missed anything?
No, I think we're good. I think
All
we're good.
right.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us almost two
Yes.
hours, but we got through it. I encourage you again, read the book of Judges, read
Mhm.
the book of Ruth in its entirety on your own. Please take advantage of the resources. If you need that chart again, just rewind this video once we're not live anymore. And yeah, we just want to help you and encourage you to get excited about the word of God and to be able to follow it on your own and start to see these key themes and these threads yourself.
Yeah.
And we thank you for joining us
Yes. Thank
again.
you, guys. Have a great night, everyone.
Have a great night. God bless you guys. Bye, everyone. Bye.